What happens when two worlds collide, worlds that are supposed to complement each other, yet instead they crash head-on? Imagine a night meant for laughter, a conversation intended to be light-hearted, but instead it spirals into something far more uncomfortable. What happens when the stage becomes a battleground? Tonight, we're delving into a moment that left audiences stunned, the kind of clash that shakes the very foundation of what we think we know about comedy, fame, and truth. The interview between Tim Allen and Jimmy Fallon, who should have been friends exchanging jokes, took a turn. What started as an evening of casual banter became a full-blown confrontation. What was supposed to be a typical late-night conversation quickly turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history. But why? How did a simple question morph into a war of words? And more importantly, what did it reveal about the changing world of comedy? Why did this clash escalate from playful to heated so quickly? And what does it say about the people who deliver the laughs we take for granted? Before we dive in, I want you to think about this. How much of what we see on TV is really us? Is it a mirror reflecting the real world? Or is it a performance, carefully crafted to make us feel something without truly challenging us? Now, let's see how everything unraveled. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, and the energy in the studio was electric. The audience, a mix of fans, critics, and casual viewers, was ready for the usual late-night spectacle. A fun, easy conversation that might feature a few laughs, some witty banter, and maybe a sneak peek at Tim Allen's latest project, Jimmy Fallon. The ever-charming host greeted his guest with that familiar smile, the one that makes you feel like he's your best friend, someone you could sit down with and share a drink. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy announced, "tonight we've got a special guest, a man who needs no introduction, the legend himself, Tim Allen." The crowd cheered as Tim stepped onto the stage, waving to the audience with that grin only he can pull off, a grin that's been a staple in comedy for decades. Tim sat down, the spotlight on him, and for a moment everything seemed perfect. The energy was high, the audience laughing, and the conversation was unfolding like any other late-night interview. Small talk about the weather, the usual chuckles about life's little quirks. Tim's humor was sharp but warm, just as expected. Jimmy asked about his latest project, and Tim responded with his signature wit. The audience laughed, everyone was at ease, and for a few moments you'd think nothing could go wrong. This was a comedy interview after all, an easy exchange of jokes and anecdotes. But sometimes, what seems like the calm before the storm is just the quietest moment before everything shifts. And then, Jimmy leaned in, his curiosity getting the better of him, as he posed a question to Tim. "So, Tim, you've been in this business for so long. You've seen it all, from the beginning to where we are now. What do you think about how comedy has evolved over the years?" It was a simple question, one most would expect to answer with a nostalgic smile or an amusing story about the good old days. But Tim's response wasn't just about the past. It wasn't a walk down memory lane. It was a challenge. This, right here, was the turning point. Jimmy's question had seemed innocent enough. After all, it was a topic that many comedians had explored in their interviews over the years. How comedy changes, how it evolves, how it reflects the world we live in. But what Jimmy didn't anticipate was the complexity behind Tim's response. As Tim leaned back in his chair, the mood shifted. His usual grin was replaced with a look of contemplation, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he were about to unravel something deeper than anyone had expected. "You know, Jimmy," Tim said, his tone measured, "that's an interesting question. But when you ask about evolution, what do you mean by that? Are we talking about comedy getting better? Or are we just talking about it getting different?" The words hung in the air. The audience, once full of eager energy, fell into an uneasy silence. A few nervous laughs slipped out, but no one really knew how to react. Jimmy, ever the quick-witted host, tried to keep the moment light, his hand tapping the desk as he chuckled. "Well, I mean, comedy changes, right? It adapts to the times. What's funny now might not have worked 20 years ago. It's all about connecting with people where they are, in the moment." Jimmy's voice was light, but the uncertainty creeping in was palpable. He was trying to steer the conversation back to the safe territory of harmless banter, but Tim wasn't biting. Tim's gaze didn't waver as he looked at Jimmy, a faint hint of skepticism on his face. Connecting with people where they are, or telling them what they should think is funny? He challenged, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp knife. Because I think a lot of comedy today isn't really about making people laugh anymore. It's about making sure you're on the right side of things. And there's a huge difference between being funny and being approved of. The air in the studio seemed to thicken. The audience, uncertain of how to interpret Tim's words, went completely silent. Jimmy's smile faltered just for a moment before he tried to cover it up with a nervous laugh. But it was clear. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a light conversation anymore. This was something else entirely. Was this just a misunderstanding? Or was there a much bigger conversation unfolding? One about comedy's role in shaping society, and perhaps society's role in shaping comedy. The tension was palpable now. What started as a casual conversation had spiraled into something much more intense. Jimmy, trying to maintain his composure, attempted to steer the conversation back to familiar ground. But Tim wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about comedy anymore. It was about something deeper, something Jimmy hadn't fully anticipated. "Look," Jimmy said, trying to recover. "Comedy changes with the times, right? What was funny 20 years ago may not work now, but that's part of evolving, right? It's about connecting with people where they are. It's about relevance." His voice had an edge to it now, more defensive than before. He was no longer just the friendly host. He was digging in his heels, but Tim wasn't letting it go. He crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and stared at Jimmy, his gaze unwavering. "Relevance to who, though?" Tim asked, his voice steady but sharp. "To the people who actually watch and pay for tickets? Or to the people who write articles the next day, telling everyone what's funny?" The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jimmy, caught off guard, looked around briefly as if searching for a way to navigate the conversation. His hand slapped the desk again, but this time the gesture was more nervous than playful. The energy had shifted, and it was clear this was no longer just a discussion about jokes. It was a battle of principles. "I built a career on making regular people laugh." Tim continued, his voice a bit softer but no less firm. "Not on pleasing critics. I'm not out here playing it safe, trying to be everyone's favorite. I made people laugh because they could relate to it, not because they were afraid not to." His words hung heavy in the air. Jimmy's face tightened. He could feel the weight of the accusation, and for a moment, the smile that had been his trademark seemed completely absent. "So, you're saying that I'm just out here trying to please people?" Jimmy asked, his voice quieter now but tinged with frustration. Tim leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked with Jimmy's. "I'm saying you're careful, Jimmy. You're careful with every joke, every bit. You've got a filter that makes sure you never upset the wrong people. That's not the same thing as being funny. That's being safe. And safe comedy, well, that's not comedy. It's performance." The words landed like a punch. The audience, once on the edge of their seats waiting for the next laugh, was now frozen. A few people exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. Was this still the show they thought they were watching? Or had something real just started to unfold? The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from light-hearted to heavy, the playful back and forth replaced by an intense exchange of ideals. Jimmy's usual charm, which had kept things easygoing up until now, was slipping away. There was a palpable tension between him and Tim, a gap widening as each side held firmly to their perspective. Jimmy, trying to hold on to his ground, sat up straighter, his eyes now sharp with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "So, what are you saying, Tim? Are you implying that I don't care about making people laugh? That I'm not doing my job right?" His voice rose slightly, a sign that the friendly banter was officially over. Tim didn't flinch. He remained calm, unshaken. "I'm not saying that you don't care about making people laugh," he replied, his tone cool, almost methodical. "I'm saying you're playing it safe. You're so careful. You're worrying about what's acceptable more than what's real. Comedy used to be about pushing boundaries, about making people uncomfortable because that's how you get to the truth. Now, it's about making sure you're not offending anyone. That's not funny. That's protection. The room was silent, and the tension was so thick you could feel it seeping through the screen. The audience, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet, fell into a tense silence. Some looked at each other nervously, others shifted in their seats. Jimmy was visibly rattled, but he wasn't backing down. "I think you're missing the point, Tim. You're acting like comedy has to be risky to be valuable. It doesn't. Being funny doesn't mean you have to be mean. You can still be real without making someone feel small. Not every joke has to punch down. It's about making people feel good, not tearing them apart." Tim's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond right away. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as though he was about to drop another bombshell. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried an undeniable weight. "But what about the truth, Jimmy? Where's the honesty in comedy? Where's the willingness to confront uncomfortable realities? When we're so busy trying to make people feel good, we lose the real connection. We're just giving them the version they want to hear. That's not honesty. That's just being liked." Jimmy's jaw tightened, and for the first time in the interview, his smile disappeared entirely. "You think I don't value honesty?" He shot back, his tone sharp. "Every night I go on that stage, sharing parts of myself, things that are real. You act like I'm just out here to please everyone. But I'm not. I'm trying to make people laugh, genuinely, and give them a break from their lives. That's my job." His voice, still firm but now tinged with frustration, revealed something deeper. He wasn't just defending his show, he was defending himself. Tim shook his head slowly, his voice never wavering. Making people laugh is one thing. Making them think is another. When was the last time you made someone really question something? Really feel something deep? You're playing it safe, Jimmy. You're curating the experience so that everyone walks away happy. But in doing that, you've lost the edge that makes comedy powerful. Without that edge, what's the point? Jimmy clenched his fist slightly, his face reddening. He was no longer just a host on a late-night show. He was someone fighting for his vision of what comedy should be. "And what do you expect me to do, Tim? Be like you? Stand up there and just say whatever I want without thinking about how it affects people? Just make jokes for the sake of pushing boundaries?" Tim's response was swift, cutting through the air with precision. "Maybe, but at least I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. I'm not trying to get approval. I'm just being real with people. I think that's what's missing today. Authenticity. And you know that, deep down, you've lost a bit of that." The words hit like a wave, leaving Jimmy in a moment of silence. He sat back, his mind racing, trying to process everything Tim had just laid out. The audience, sensing the change, fell into an uneasy quiet. Some seemed uncomfortable, while others leaned forward, captivated by the unexpected depth of the exchange. The room was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The energy had shifted from playful banter to something much heavier, something deeper. Jimmy's face was flushed, his jaw clenched as he struggled to regain control of the situation. But Tim wasn't backing down. He wasn't here for small talk anymore. He was here to make a point, to expose something about comedy, about society, about truth. "You know, Jimmy," Tim said, his voice calm but firm, "it's not about standing up there and just saying whatever pops into your head. I'm not talking about shock value or trying to make people uncomfortable for the sake of it. But when did comedy become something that's always comfortable? When did it become a tool for validation instead of something that challenges people? The reality is, you've created an environment where the audience feels like they have to laugh at everything you say, even if it's not funny, because they don't want to feel left out. There's no risk anymore. It's all safe." The words struck a nerve with Jimmy, and it was clear from the way he stiffened that Tim's accusations weren't easy to swallow. Jimmy's eyes flashed with frustration, and he leaned forward, speaking with more intensity now. "What are you trying to say, Tim? That my audience isn't real? That they're just following along because that's what they're supposed to do?" Tim leaned in slightly, meeting Jimmy's eyes without hesitation. "I'm not saying your audience is fake, Jimmy, but the environment you've created, where everything is polished, everything is rehearsed, has made it hard for them to feel anything genuine. They clap when they're supposed to. They laugh on cue. But how much of that is truly organic? How much of it is actually funny? The room seemed to hold its breath. Jimmy, no longer hiding his annoyance, shot back, "You're saying that what I'm doing isn't real. That somehow, because my show isn't exactly like yours, it's less authentic? You think you've got a monopoly on what's real in comedy?" Tim didn't flinch. "I'm not saying that," he replied calmly. "What I'm saying is that when comedy becomes about appeasing everyone, it loses its power. Comedy is about speaking truths, sometimes hard ones. But now it's become a performance, an act. And that's not the same thing as honesty." Jimmy was getting more defensive now. The lines between the two men were becoming clearer, the gap widening. "And what about you, Tim? You think you're above all that? That you didn't play the same game when you were on TV, pushing characters and ads to sell more tickets, more products?" He leaned back, his voice tinged with bitterness. "So, what's the difference, huh? You think you weren't playing by the rules?" The audience shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Tim's response. Jimmy's words had hit home, but Tim wasn't rattled. His response was measured, his voice steady. "I played by the rules, sure," he said. "I followed the content guidelines, the standards that come with being on network TV. But I didn't pretend. I wasn't trying to be everyone's voice. I wasn't pushing an agenda. I made jokes about life, about being a dad, about screwing up, about real things people could relate to. You want to talk about authenticity? I wasn't out here worrying about what critics thought or trying to be liked by everyone. I just wanted to make people laugh. That's it, there it was." The words hung in the air, challenging everything Jimmy had built his show on. Tim wasn't just questioning Jimmy's methods, he was questioning the very essence of what late-night television had become. Jimmy, his face reddening, let out a short, forced laugh. "So, now you're saying I'm just doing it for approval? That I'm playing it safe for the critics? Well, maybe that's exactly the problem, Tim. You're stuck in the past. You haven't evolved with the times. You're still holding on to something that's gone. Comedy has changed. And maybe it's you who hasn't." The words hit Tim like a blow, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe you're right, Jimmy. Maybe I haven't changed. And maybe that's why people still come to see me. Because I'm not trying to be everything to everyone. I'm just being honest. I'm not trying to please every critic or every person in the room. I'm just making people laugh because they get it. They feel it. And that's what matters." Jimmy's face twitched. He could feel the frustration building inside him, but he wasn't ready to back down. "You think you're the only one who gets it? The only one who can make people laugh for real? You think your way is the only way?" Tim's response was calm but cut through the air like a knife. "I'm not saying it's the only way, Jimmy. I'm saying it's a way. A real way. But you're too busy trying to please everyone to see that." The audience, sensing the rising tension, seemed to hold its collective breath. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others seemed captivated, as though they were witnessing something more than just an argument. It was clear this was more than an interview. This was a battle of ideologies, a clash of philosophies about what comedy should be, and no one knew where it would go from here. The silence in the room was deafening. Jimmy sat there, eyes narrowed, fists clenched at his sides, trying to compose himself. Tim's words had struck a nerve deeper than he wanted to admit. There was something about the way Tim spoke, so sure of himself, so certain that he was right, that made Jimmy question everything he'd built. But he wasn't about to let that show. Not now. Not in front of the audience. "You're talking about honesty, Tim," Jimmy said, his voice a little sharper now. "But what you're not seeing is that I am being honest with my audience. I talk about my fears, my kids, my life. I open up, I connect with people in a way that's real. Just because I'm not doing it in your style doesn't mean it's fake. That's not what I'm about. I don't have to be abrasive or confrontational to be real." Tim's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "You think honesty is just about sharing personal details, Jimmy? That's easy. You're talking about the safe, feel-good version of honesty. You share your life, yes, but you're careful with it. It's been filtered, packaged for approval. The realness you're talking about? It's been sanitized." Tim's voice grew more intense, as if he was trying to make Jimmy understand something he wasn't willing to hear. Jimmy's face flushed with frustration. So now you're saying everything I do is fake, that I don't care about my audience, that I'm just out here giving them what they want to hear, not what they need. Tim shook his head, his voice low and deliberate. That's not what I'm saying, Jimmy. I'm saying you're too concerned about keeping everyone happy. You've created a world where nothing is too edgy, nothing is too challenging. Your show, your comedy, it's all calculated. It's safe. You make people feel good, sure, but it's not real growth, it's not real comedy. The audience seemed to shift in their seats. Some looked uncomfortable, others riveted, but no one was laughing anymore. There was no cue to laugh this time, no studio applause sign flashing. What had been a casual interview had morphed into something far more serious, a deeper conversation about what it means to be real in a world that demands comfort. Jimmy swallowed, his hands now gripping the edge of the desk as he leaned forward. And you think your way is the answer, Tim? You think you're the only one who knows what's real, what's honest? Do you honestly think comedy can't evolve, can't adapt to the world we live in now? Tim's eyes narrowed, his voice cool and measured. I'm not saying it can't evolve, Jimmy. I'm saying it has evolved, and maybe it's lost its way. There's a difference between evolution and compromise. Evolving for the right reasons is about growth. But what you're doing, what we've all started doing, is about not rocking the boat. It's about making sure we're all on the right side. And when we do that, we lose the very thing that made comedy great. The edge, the truth, the willingness to say what others won't, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Jimmy's jaw tightened, but there was a crack in his voice as he responded. And what about you, Tim? What about the time you spent building a career on the very system you're now criticizing? You really think you've been more real than everyone else just because you didn't have producers telling you what's acceptable? You think your sitcoms weren't filtered? Your characters weren't designed to appeal to a certain audience? You think you've never been part of the machine? Tim didn't flinch. He sat back in his chair, his eyes steady, reflecting a calm that was beginning to unsettle Jimmy. I played by the rules, sure. I followed the guidelines, language, content, all of it. But I didn't pretend to be something I wasn't. I didn't make my comedy about fitting into a mold. I told stories about life, about family, about being a regular guy. I didn't pretend to be everyone's voice. I was just honest. And that, Jimmy, is what's missing today. There was a long pause, and it felt like the world had stopped moving. The audience was on edge, their emotions hanging in the balance. Some looked at Tim with newfound admiration, others at Jimmy with confusion. It was clear that what had started as a friendly conversation had turned into an ideological battle, and the stakes had never been higher. Jimmy's face was flushed now, his frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. He slammed his hand on the desk, but it was controlled, deliberate. You think you're better than everyone else because you don't follow the rules? Because you think you're not playing the game? You're still playing the game, Tim. You just think your way is better. Well, I've got news for you. You can't have it both ways. Tim leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. I'm not saying I'm better. I'm saying that the moment we stop challenging the status quo, we stop being real. We stop making people think. And when that happens, comedy stops being important. It's just noise. The audience, visibly shaken by the intensity of the exchange, now sat completely still. Some appeared to be processing what had just been said, others unsure of how to react. It was clear that this wasn't just a debate about comedy. It was a debate about the very purpose of comedy, about authenticity, and about the art of telling the truth. The tension in the room was unbearable. Jimmy's anger had reached its peak, but Tim remained calm, unwavering, like a steady rock amidst the storm. For a moment it felt like the interview was teetering on the edge of something explosive, and neither man was willing to back down. Jimmy's voice, now strained, cut through the silence. You know what, Tim? Maybe I've tried to be respectful. I've tried to hear you out. But you're not listening to me. You've been sitting here accusing me of all these things, telling me that I'm just playing it safe, that I'm not real. You think it's easy to go out every night, make people laugh, and keep them entertained while being genuine? You think I don't care about the truth? Tim leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving Jimmy. I'm not saying you don't care, Jimmy. I'm saying you're afraid of the truth. You've built this entire show around keeping people comfortable, around telling them exactly what they want to hear. There's nothing real about that. And that's why I'm not afraid to say what I'm saying. Because I'm not trying to keep anyone happy. I'm not trying to be liked. The words were a gut punch to Jimmy, but it was clear Tim wasn't pulling punches anymore. The smile, the easygoing charm, all of it had disappeared. What was left was a conversation so raw, so real that neither of them could ignore it. The audience, still on edge, seemed to be holding their breath. Was this still a late-night interview, or had it become something else entirely? Jimmy, his voice now thick with emotion, finally said, "You think I don't know what it means to take risks, Tim? You think I don't know what it's like to go out there and put yourself on the line every single night? I've been doing this for years, giving everything I have to entertain people. I'm not pretending to be something I'm not." There was a long silence as Jimmy's words sank in. Tim looked at him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, without missing a beat, he replied, "Maybe you're right. Maybe you've been doing this for years. But somewhere along the way, you stopped taking risks. You stopped challenging the status quo. You started worrying more about approval than truth. And when you do that, Jimmy, you lose something. You lose the heart of comedy." The words hit Jimmy harder than he expected. He knew Tim was right. Somewhere along the way, he'd sacrificed something. He had become so concerned with pleasing everyone, with being the safe choice, that the edge had been dulled. The truth was uncomfortable, but maybe it was time to face it. But just as the weight of Tim's words started to settle in, Jimmy's jaw tightened. He stood up, pushing his chair back with force, the calm demeanor he had so carefully maintained slipping away. "You need to leave, Tim, right now. I'm done with this. You've come on my show, insulted me, insulted my audience, and now you're just throwing all this crap at me. I'm not doing this anymore. Get out." The words were out before Jimmy could stop them. The room, once filled with tension, was now heavy with a different kind of silence, a silence filled with shock and disbelief. The camera cut away briefly, catching a glimpse of Tim's face, unreadable, calm. As he stood up, Tim slowly rose from his seat, his eyes still fixed on Jimmy. "I came here to have a real conversation, Jimmy, but if you're not interested in hearing the truth, then I'm done. You asked me about comedy, and I gave you the answer. If you can't handle that, then maybe you're proving my point." He turned, walking toward the side of the stage, leaving Jimmy standing behind his desk, his hands shaking. The audience was still frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to react. Was this really happening? Was this the end of the interview, or had something deeper just been revealed? As Tim reached the curtain and turned to look back at Jimmy, he spoke one last time, his words heavy with the weight of everything that had been said. "The saddest part of all of this, Jimmy, is that you actually have talent. I've seen it. But you're more interested in keeping everyone comfortable, keeping everyone happy, than actually challenging them. You've traded being funny for being liked, and now you're stuck in this bubble pretending it's real. But it's not." The camera lingered on Jimmy's face, his expression hardening as he tried to regain control, but it was clear. This wasn't just about comedy anymore. It was about truth, about integrity, about whether Jimmy was willing to face what he had become. Jimmy swallowed, his voice low but steady when he finally spoke. "I tried, Tim. I really did. I tried to have a conversation with you. I tried to find some common ground. But I don't think we're ever going to agree on this." Tim, his back turned, paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, without looking back, he disappeared through the curtain. The audience was left in stunned silence. Jimmy stood there for a moment, his chest heaving as he tried to gather his thoughts. The show, the interview, everything had spiraled into something none of them had expected. Finally, Jimmy cleared his throat and spoke, his voice strained but composed. "Well, that was something, wasn't it? I think we can all agree that didn't go how we planned. But, hey, we'll be right back after this break. Don't go anywhere. We've got a great musical guest lined up, and I promise the rest of the show will be a lot lighter than this." As the camera cut to commercial, the audience remained silent, processing what they had just witnessed. The energy in the room was completely different now. What started as a typical late-night interview had turned into something unforgettable, something deeper. The commercial break seemed to stretch on forever. The audience, still processing the whirlwind they had just witnessed, sat in a stunned silence. Some were whispering to each other, others checked their phones, likely to see if the world had already caught on to what had just transpired. Was it real? Was it scripted? The tension that hung in the studio was thick, a stark contrast to the energy that had filled the room only an hour earlier. Behind the scenes, the crew scrambled to regain some semblance of order. The producers were in a frenzy, trying to maintain control of the situation. But nothing could erase the moment that had just unfolded. The raw, unscripted clash between two comedic giants that had left the audience gasping. When the cameras returned, the studio was quieter than before. Jimmy sat behind his desk, hands folded, his face still flushed, but with an air of forced composure. He looked directly into the camera, his smile strained but attempting to return to his usual charm. "Well," Jimmy began, his voice steady but clearly affected. "That was, something, right?" He paused, giving a nervous laugh. The energy in the room felt different now, thicker, heavier. "I don't really know what to say about what just happened, but I think we can all agree it wasn't the interview we expected." He rubbed his face with both hands, then looked back up at the camera. "But hey, that's life, right? Sometimes things don't go as planned, and we all learn from those moments. I came into this thinking it would be a fun chat, maybe share some laughs and talk about old times, but instead, we ended up diving into something deeper." Jimmy cleared his throat and tried to regain his usual upbeat tone, though the cracks were evident. "I think we all saw what happened. That wasn't just about comedy. That was about the way we see the world, the way we navigate our truths in a space that's constantly evolving. It's about how we connect with people, how we make them laugh, how we challenge them to think. And I'm not going to pretend that everything was easy or that I didn't feel blindsided at times. But I will say this, comedy is hard. It's always been hard." There was a shift in Jimmy's demeanor as he continued. The playful, carefree host who had once ruled late night was now replaced with something more introspective, more guarded. Maybe it's gotten harder in some ways because we're more aware of how our words affect people. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we've become more thoughtful. And yeah, maybe some people think that makes us soft, or that it makes the comedy less edgy. But I think being responsible with our words, being respectful, isn't weakness. It's strength. It's growth. He paused again, looking down for a moment as though weighing his next words carefully. "But let's be real for a second," he said, his voice softer. "Not every joke needs to punch down. Not every joke needs to tear someone down to make people laugh. And maybe that's what's missing from today's comedy. Genuine, heartfelt laughter that doesn't need to come at anyone's expense." Jimmy looked directly at the camera now, his voice steady but with a newfound sense of vulnerability. "So yeah, I think comedy has changed. And maybe, just maybe, that's for the better. The world's changed, and we all have to evolve with it. We can't be afraid of progress. We can't be afraid of being thoughtful. Because if we are, we risk losing what makes comedy truly meaningful." The audience, still a little stunned, began to stir. Some clapped, others murmured, but there was an undeniable shift in the energy. Jimmy's words had cut through the tension, offering a moment of reflection after the storm. "Anyway," Jimmy continued, trying to shake off the heaviness in the room, "I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers. I'm just trying to do the best I can, the best I know how. And at the end of the day, I hope that's enough. I hope you all still see that. Because I really do care about this show, and I care about what we do here." The camera zoomed in slightly on Jimmy's face as he gave a small, tired smile. "We've got a great musical guest tonight. And I promise we'll keep things a little lighter. So, stay with us. We'll be right back." The show cut to another break, but the energy in the room had shifted permanently. The light-hearted late-night show, once filled with carefree laughs and playful banter, now felt like something else entirely. Something deeper, something real. The cameras cut to the break and the buzz in the studio remained, albeit quieter now. People whispered to each other in hushed tones. still processing the unexpected confrontation that had just unfolded. What had started as an ordinary late-night interview had morphed into a rare, raw look at the complexities of comedy, identity, and authenticity. No one would walk away unchanged from what had happened. Jimmy sat backstage, his mind still reeling from the sharp exchange. The crew prepared for the rest of the show, but there was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that what had happened couldn't just be swept away. It had to be acknowledged. Tim Allen had walked off the stage, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. But Jimmy couldn't shake the weight of what Tim had said. Maybe it wasn't about being right or wrong. Maybe it was about facing something uncomfortable, about realizing that comedy, in its truest form, was supposed to shake things up, make us feel, and sometimes make us question who we are and why we laugh. The camera rolled once more, and Jimmy was back at his desk. His usual composure was replaced by something more thoughtful, more reflective. This time, when he addressed the audience, there was no scripted charm, no rehearsed lines. It was just him, raw and real. "Look," Jimmy began, his voice quieter than before, "I'm not going to sit here and pretend that everything that happened earlier tonight was easy. I'll be the first to admit. It was uncomfortable. It was tough. But that's life, right? Sometimes we get knocked off course. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But the point is, we keep going. We keep trying." He took a deep breath, leaning forward slightly. "Maybe comedy has changed. Maybe it's supposed to. Maybe that's the whole point." What Tim said, it made me think. He's right about a lot of things. Comedy has evolved. But it's not just about what's funny anymore. It's about how we make people feel. About what's behind the laughs. Jimmy paused, looking directly into the camera as if he were speaking to each viewer personally. And maybe, just maybe, it's okay to be more thoughtful about it. It's okay to make people laugh without making them uncomfortable. It's okay to be real in a different way. I can't promise that everything I do will be perfect, but I can promise that I'm going to keep learning, keep evolving, and, hopefully, keep making people laugh while I'm doing it. There was a long pause as he let the weight of his words settle. Maybe there is a balance to be found between being funny and being kind, between taking risks and being respectful. Maybe the world doesn't have to be one way or the other. Maybe we're all just trying to find our way, trying to make sense of it all. He cleared his throat, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Anyway, I think I've said enough for tonight. I'm sure the comment section is going to be interesting. I'll leave that to you guys. But, seriously, I want to thank you all for sticking with us through this. It's been a ride, and I appreciate every one of you who's still here with me. Jimmy looked down at his desk, then back up at the camera with a more genuine smile this time. We've got an amazing musical guest coming up, and I promise the rest of the show is going to be a lot lighter. Thanks for joining me tonight, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Take care, everyone. As the credits began to roll, the audience clapped, but it was a different kind of applause this time. Not for the jokes or the performances, but for the honesty, for the courage to face uncomfortable truths, for the willingness to learn and grow, even in the spotlight. The studio was still buzzing with whispers, but there was a sense of closure, an unspoken acknowledgement that something real had just happened. And, for better or worse, the night would be remembered for more than just comedy. It would be remembered for a conversation that pushed the boundaries of what was comfortable, a conversation that made people think. And in the world of comedy, maybe that's the most important thing of all.